The temple courtyard was silent under the pale dawn sky, where the stone floor still glistened with night's dew. Ethan felt a chill run through him as Master Hiroshi stood before the gathered monks. Hiroshi said, "A truth must be spoken today, one that cannot be softened." Ethan's chest tightened. He looked around at the disciples kneeling in rows. Their eyes were lowered, yet he sensed their unease ripple through the silence. Hiroshi said, "One among you clings so tightly to perfection that the path has already slipped away from them." Ethan's breath caught, his mind racing, his heart pounding with dread. Daniel, the fellow disciple beside him, tilted his head in confusion. Ethan said, "Master, who has strayed so far?" Hiroshi's gaze fell on him, sharp and unyielding. Hiroshi said, "You." The words struck like thunder, tearing Ethan's certainty apart. He felt his entire world collapse into unbearable doubt. His control shattered in a single instant, replaced by trembling fear. The silence thickened after the declaration, each breath weighed heavy. Ethan tried to speak, but his throat tightened as if bound. Ethan said, "Master, I do not understand." His voice cracked. Hiroshi's eyes, calm and unwavering, pierced through the air. Hiroshi said, "You grasp too tightly, Ethan. Your control blinds you to the path." Ethan's chest burned as if pierced by invisible fire. Daniel leaned closer, whispering, "Why you?" Ethan turned his gaze downward, shame flooding his veins. Hiroshi closed his eyes briefly, then said, "The seed of awakening lies in surrender, not in mastery." Ethan felt as if the ground beneath him had fallen away, leaving him suspended in unbearable doubt. The temple bells in the distance rang faintly, cutting through his fear, each tone reminding him of the fragility of his own certainty. The air carried the faint smell of incense as the monks shifted uneasily. Ethan clenched his fists, trembling as though holding back tears. Ethan said, "I tried, Master, every breath, every posture, every chant." Hiroshi's expression remained unmoved. Hiroshi said, "Effort is not the issue. Attachment is." Daniel whispered, "He says you cling too much." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat aching. Ethan said, "How do I release what binds me, if it is all I know?" Hiroshi's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained steady. Hiroshi said, "Only by breaking can one be whole." The words pressed on Ethan's chest, like a crushing weight. He felt torn between collapse and defiance, lost within the storm of his own fear. The bells echoed again, faint and distant, pulling Ethan deeper into despair. He remembered his long hours of meditation, the endless nights of repeating chants, all now seeming hollow. Ethan said, "I gave everything, yet it feels like nothing." Hiroshi's presence was unshaken. Hiroshi said, "When nothing remains, truth is revealed." Ethan's breathing quickened, his hands trembled as he fought the pull of hopelessness. Daniel looked down, silent, unable to meet Ethan's gaze. The disciples around them shifted in discomfort, their robes brushing against stone. The morning sun slowly lit the courtyard walls, shadows melting away. Ethan's thoughts raged, but the sound of his own heartbeat drowned out everything. The stillness returned, heavy as stone. Ethan lowered his head, feeling his world slip away. Hiroshi's words echoed like thunder in his chest, reshaping his very sense of self. Ethan said, "If surrender is the path, I no longer know who I am." Hiroshi stepped closer, his shadow falling over Ethan. Hiroshi said, "Then you are ready to begin." Ethan closed his eyes, tears threatening to fall. Daniel reached out, but his hand stopped short, suspended in uncertainty. Around them, the disciples kept silent, each afraid to break the fragile balance. The faint cry of a crow overhead broke the silence, carrying a foreboding note into the air. Ethan felt stripped bare, as if the weight of centuries pressed on his shoulders. The temple's meditation hall was dimly lit, its wooden beams stretching into silence. Ethan sat cross-legged, but his posture sagged under invisible weight. Ethan said, "Why do my thoughts never still, even when I close my eyes?" His voice trembled. Master Hiroshi sat at the far end, his figure calm, as unmoving as stone. Hiroshi said, because you cling to the thought of stillness itself. Ethan's head dropped, shame swirling like dust in the air. Daniel whispered from his mat nearby, "You pushed too hard, Ethan." The faint flicker of candlelight painted their shadows against the wall, flickering like restless spirits. Hiroshi's eyes remained steady. Hiroshi said, "Peace comes when the chase ends." Ethan pressed his palms together, his lips dry, but the words lodged in his throat. The silence felt heavier than his body, pressing down until he thought he might break apart. Ethan's chest ached with each shallow breath, the hall's silence amplifying his struggle. Ethan said, "I practice and practice, yet the emptiness grows louder." Hiroshi tilted his head slightly, eyes calm as ever. Hiroshi said, "What you call emptiness is your teacher." Ethan's fists tightened on his knees, trembling. Daniel glanced sideways, his brows furrowed. Daniel said, "Perhaps you fear silence more than you know?" Ethan's gaze lifted to the tall paper windows, glowing with faint morning light. The sound of a bird outside broke the stillness, fragile yet piercing. Hiroshi said, "When you stop resisting, silence becomes truth." Ethan felt his heart lurch, torn between defiance and surrender. The hall smelled of aged wood and burning wax, each breath filling him with both heaviness and clarity. The incense smoke curled upward, pale ribbons dissolving into darkness. Ethan closed his eyes tightly, fighting his racing thoughts. Ethan said, "The silence burns me, Master. I cannot bear it." Hiroshi's voice was even, deliberate. Hiroshi said, "To burn is to be purified." Ethan's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding. Daniel lowered his gaze, lips pressed in unease. Hiroshi leaned forward slightly, his tone unshaken. Hiroshi said, "You want control, but control is the illusion." Ethan's breath quickened as shame filled his chest like fire. Ethan said, "If I let go, there will be nothing left of me." Hiroshi replied softly, "Only then can the true self appear." The smoke thickened in the room, the faint golden light painting patterns through its shifting form. The weight of Hiroshi's words struck Ethan deeper than any blade. He bowed his head, forehead pressing hard against the wooden floor. Ethan said, "I am failing everyone. I am failing myself." Daniel's hand twitched on his lap, but he did not speak. Hiroshi's eyes narrowed slightly, his calm breaking into subtle intensity. Hiroshi said, "Failure is a gate. Only through its threshold can you awaken." Ethan's tears fell onto the floor, absorbed by the wood's grain. He said, "But if I walk through, who remains of me?" Hiroshi's tone softened. Hiroshi said, "The one who has always been here." The silence that followed was unbearable and tender, all at once, broken only by the distant hum of temple bells. Ethan's body trembled, his surrender now within reach, yet still resisted. The hall's stillness deepened, every breath echoing like thunder in Ethan's chest. Ethan slowly lifted his head, eyes red from tears. Ethan said, "If surrender is the path, then I am already lost." Hiroshi gazed at him, face serene, voice steady. Hiroshi said, "To be lost is to be found." Daniel's lips parted, but no words came. The tension held him silent. Ethan wiped his face with trembling hands, the candlelight reflecting in his wet eyes. Hiroshi leaned back, his shadow stretching long across the hall. Hiroshi said, "In letting go of who you think you are, the truth breathes freely." Ethan felt the walls of his mind crack, each word dismantling his fragile defenses. The incense curled higher, dissolving into nothingness, as if mirroring the lesson itself. The courtyard echoed with the sound of the wooden gong, summoning the disciples for meditation. Ethan sat at the center, the weight of expectation pressing on him like iron. Hiroshi's voice cut through the morning air. Hiroshi said, "You will hold your breath until the silence speaks to you." Ethan's chest tightened at the impossible demand. Daniel glanced at him, eyes wide with worry, but said nothing. Ethan thought, "This will crush me." He closed his eyes, drawing breath slowly, but panic flared as his lungs strained. Sweat rolled down his temples, and his body trembled. Hiroshi watched without a flicker of emotion. Hiroshi said, "Control is your prison." Ethan gasped inward, mind screaming as the courtyard fell silent, except for the pounding of his heart. Ethan's face burned as he forced himself to hold longer, each second a battle against suffocation. Ethan said, "I cannot endure this." His body shook violently. Hiroshi said, "Then let go of endurance." Daniel leaned forward whispering, "Breathe, Ethan, or you'll collapse." But Ethan ignored him, eyes squeezed shut. Memories of failure flashed, visions of shame and emptiness. He thought, if I fail, I prove him right. Hiroshi's gaze was sharp, unrelenting. Hiroshi said, "You cling, and clinging is the root of your pain." Ethan's vision blurred, tears mixing with sweat. His pride held him in place, but his soul screamed for release. The courtyard felt smaller, pressing in, as if the air itself conspired against him. Ethan finally gasped, breaking the silence with a desperate inhale. His chest heaved as he fell forward onto his hands. Ethan said, "I failed again." His voice cracked, filled with despair. Hiroshi stood, stepping closer, his presence towering. Hiroshi said, "You failed only your illusion." Daniel rushed to Ethan's side, his hand steady on Ethan's back. Daniel said, "You push yourself beyond reason." Ethan's eyes watered, shame cutting deeper than breath. He whispered, without control, "Who am I?" Hiroshi's shadow fell over him like a storm. Hiroshi said, "You are no one, and that is where freedom begins." The disciples watched in hushed silence, their robes brushing the stone as they shifted uneasily. The sky darkened with clouds, as if echoing Ethan's turmoil. He rose unsteadily, anger flashing in his eyes. Ethan said, "You demand the impossible." Hiroshi remained still, unshaken. Hiroshi said, "Only the impossible reveals truth." Ethan clenched his fists, fury and despair colliding. Daniel said, "Ethan, calm yourself." Ethan shook his head violently. Ethan said, "No, I gave everything, and still I am broken." Hiroshi's eyes narrowed. Hiroshi said, "Only broken things can reflect the light." Ethan's chest rose and fell in ragged rhythm. The courtyard wind picked up, scattering leaves across the stone, each gust pulling him further into his storm of pride and resistance. The courtyard grew heavy with silence after Ethan's outburst, the disciples frozen. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his fists striking the stone. Ethan said, "Why must I be torn apart?" Hiroshi stepped closer, voice low yet sharp. Hiroshi said, "Because only through tearing can the illusion be shed." Ethan looked up, face streaked with sweat and tears. Ethan said, "I hate this path. I hate myself." Daniel's eyes softened, his voice trembling. Daniel said, "You do not see yet, Ethan. You are closer than you think." Hiroshi turned slightly, his robe shifting with the wind. Hiroshi said, "The storm inside you is the teacher you resist." The disciples bowed lower, sensing the sacred weight of the moment. The evening sun dipped low, washing the temple grounds in amber light. Ethan sat by the koi pond, his reflection distorted in the ripples. Ethan said, "I chase and fall, again and again. What remains of me?" Master Hiroshi stood nearby, his voice quiet yet unyielding. Hiroshi said, "The one who chases sees only the chase." Daniel approached, his steps hesitant. Daniel said, "You cannot keep tearing yourself apart." Ethan pressed his palms into his thighs, trembling with frustration. Ethan said, "If I stop chasing, will I vanish?" Hiroshi gazed at the water, his tone sharp as a blade. Hiroshi said, "You will vanish only if you cling to the self that is false." The air grew still, the koi circling beneath the fading light, as if echoing the riddle. The surface of the pond shimmered as Ethan leaned closer, seeing his face break into fragments on the water. Ethan said, "This reflection, always broken." Hiroshi placed a hand behind his back, posture unwavering. Hiroshi said, "What you see broken was never whole." Daniel crouched nearby, whispering. Daniel said, "Your fight is not with silence, but with yourself." Ethan's breath hitched, anger flashing. Ethan said, "Then what is real? What is left when all I hold falls away?" Hiroshi's eyes met his with piercing steadiness. Hiroshi said, "What is left has always been here." The wind stirred the trees, scattering faint blossoms across the pond's surface, as if nature itself punctuated the words. Ethan's chest burned, but beneath it flickered something unfamiliar: release. The silence deepened, broken only by the hum of evening cicadas. Ethan's hands trembled over the pond's edge, as if afraid to touch. Ethan said, "I built walls from rules, discipline, control. Now they crumble." Hiroshi stepped closer, his tone steady. Hiroshi said, "They crumble because they were never real." Daniel frowned, his voice soft but urgent. Daniel said, "Ethan, maybe this breaking is your path." Ethan turned sharply, voice cracking. Ethan said, "Or my destruction?" Hiroshi lifted a finger toward the sky, the crimson light painting his face. Hiroshi said, "Destruction of illusion is birth of truth." The words pierced Ethan, his fear colliding with a glimpse of clarity, fragile yet undeniable. The cicadas grew louder, as if chanting with the wind. The temple bell rang, its echo heavy through the grounds. Ethan clutched his chest, words spilling with desperation. Ethan said, "If all I know is illusion, then I am nothing." Hiroshi's gaze did not waver. Hiroshi said, "You fear nothingness, but it is the doorway to freedom." Daniel reached for Ethan's shoulder, his hand trembling midair. Daniel said, "Do not lose yourself completely." Ethan's eyes brimmed with tears, the ground beneath him spinning with doubt. Ethan said, "If I dissolve, what stands?" Hiroshi's voice grew firm, like stone against the storm. Hiroshi said, "The truth that never moved." The bell's fading hum lingered, each note vibrating through Ethan's bones like an answer unspoken. His body shook, but his heart leaned into the crack forming within. The air grew cooler as night approached, the pond now reflecting only the dim glow of lanterns. Ethan sank lower, palms pressed against the earth. Ethan said, "I cannot tell where I end and the illusion begins." Hiroshi's figure loomed in the lantern light, shadows stretching across the stones. Hiroshi said, "You never began, Ethan, you only believed you did." Daniel closed his eyes, his whisper breaking. Daniel said, "Listen to him, stop fighting." Ethan lifted his face, tears streaking his cheeks, but within them glimmered something fragile, understanding. Ethan said, "If nothing defines me, then perhaps I am free." Hiroshi's lips curved into the faintest smile. Hiroshi said, "At last, the truth cracks the shell." The lanterns swayed in the night breeze, as silence held the moment in reverence. The storm clouds rolled across the sky, casting the courtyard in darkness. Ethan collapsed onto the stones, his body trembling with exhaustion. Ethan said, "I cannot endure another breath." His voice cracked like broken glass. Hiroshi approached slowly, his robe brushing against the ground. Hiroshi said, "Endurance was never the path." Ethan's chest heaved, his eyes wet, his fists pressed hard against the earth. Daniel cried out, "Ethan, stop, before you destroy yourself." Ethan raised his head, his face twisted with despair. Ethan said, "I gave everything, and I am left with nothing." Hiroshi's gaze sharpened, his words slicing the air. Hiroshi said, "Nothing is the beginning of all things." The wind howled through the courtyard, scattering leaves like fragments of a shattered soul. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold against Ethan's skin. He pressed his palms flat to the stone, gasping as if drowning in air. Ethan said, "I am broken beyond repair." Daniel rushed forward, kneeling at his side. Daniel said, "You are not broken, you are human." Hiroshi stood behind, unmoving as rain streaked his robe. Hiroshi said, "Only when the vessel breaks can it hold truth." Ethan's tears mixed with the rain, his face blurred between agony and release. Ethan said, If I surrender, what remains of me? Hiroshi's eyes burned with unshaken clarity. Hiroshi said, only the self that was always here. Thunder cracked above, echoing the storm raging in Ethan's heart. Ethan screamed, the sound raw, torn from his chest. Ethan said, I cannot hold on. His voice echoed off the temple walls. Daniel flinched, his hand tightening on Ethan's arm. Hiroshi's voice rose above the storm, unwavering. Hiroshi said, then let go. The words struck like lightning. Ethan froze, his body quaking, his pride unraveling. Ethan whispered, let go. His hands loosened from the stone, fingers splayed wide, as if releasing centuries of burden. Hiroshi stepped closer, eyes steady. Hiroshi said, only through surrender will you find the stillness you seek. Ethan collapsed forward, forehead pressing to the wet stone, his tears vanishing into the rain. The storm broke fully, rain cascading across the courtyard. Ethan's body shook violently, but then stilled. Ethan whispered, I have nothing left. Hiroshi bent slightly, his voice quiet but piercing. Hiroshi said, and so, you have everything. Daniel's eyes filled with tears as he whispered, Ethan, you are free. Ethan's chest rose and fell, slower now, each breath less burdened. The storm's roar softened into rhythm, like a drum of release. Ethan lifted his head, water streaming down his face, but his eyes carried a fragile clarity. Hiroshi said, this is the moment you were meant to meet. The disciples, standing at a distance, bowed their heads as if the sky itself had given witness to the surrender. The rain eased, tapering to a gentle drizzle, the storm exhausted. Ethan remained on his knees, his shoulders rising in deep, steady breaths. Ethan said, I am empty, yet I feel whole. Hiroshi's lips curved into the faintest smile. Hiroshi said, wholeness is born in emptiness. Daniel's hand stayed firm on Ethan's shoulder, grounding him. Daniel whispered, you found it. Ethan closed his eyes, peace washing through him, a calm he had never known. The temple bells rang faintly in the distance, not as judgment, but as blessing. Hiroshi turned toward the hall, his voice carried by the soft wind. Hiroshi said, at last, the illusion breaks. Ethan's tears mixed with rain, not of sorrow, but release. The storm had passed, and the courtyard glistened with rainwater reflecting soft dawn light. Ethan walked slowly, every step lighter, as if the weight had lifted from his chest. Ethan said, I feel no chains, only air. Daniel followed closely, relief in his eyes. Daniel said, you look as if the storm never touched you. Hiroshi watched from the temple steps, his presence serene, his voice steady. Hiroshi said, peace is not found in still skies, but in the storm that teaches surrender. Ethan's hands brushed against the wet leaves, his lips curved with a faint smile. For the first time, the silence did not suffocate him, it embraced him. He inhaled deeply, the scent of earth and rain filling his lungs with calm. The disciples gathered in silence, their eyes drawn to Ethan's calm face. Ethan bowed his head gently toward them. Ethan said, I do not walk ahead of you, I walk with you. His voice carried steady resonance. Daniel lowered his eyes, whispering, he has changed. Hiroshi stepped forward, nodding once, his expression unreadable but approving. Hiroshi said, in surrender, he has found strength. The disciples bowed, their robes rustling softly like the wind through trees. Ethan's heart swelled, not with pride, but with stillness. He thought, I no longer need to prove anything. The temple bells chimed faintly, not as judgment, but as harmony. The air was filled with the gentle rhythm of belonging. Ethan wandered the temple garden, droplets still clinging to the leaves. He paused before a cherry tree, blossoms trembling in the breeze. Ethan said, even in falling, there is beauty. His words were soft, carried by the air. Daniel leaned against the tree trunk, smiling faintly. Daniel said, you finally see what was always here. Hiroshi walked behind them, his steps unhurried. Hiroshi said, the path is not to escape life, but to embrace it as it is. Ethan touched one blossom gently, watching it drift into the pond below. He felt no loss, only wholeness. The air shimmered with the scent of blossoms and damp earth, carrying peace through every breath. Ethan walked along the temple corridor, lanterns swinging faintly in the morning breeze. His reflections stretched across the wet wooden floor. Ethan said, "I searched for truth in control, but it lived in surrender." Hiroshi's voice answered from behind, calm and steady. Hiroshi said, "The illusion of control is the heaviest chain." Daniel placed a hand on the railing, smiling. Daniel said, "And now the chain is gone." Ethan looked out at the mountains beyond the temple, their peaks crowned with mist. He thought, "I am not bound by the climb, for I already stand in the sky." The corridor echoed softly with the quiet rhythm of their steps, no longer burdened by conflict. The garden's silence wrapped around them, as Ethan paused near the stone statue of the Buddha. He knelt, not in defeat, but in reverence. Ethan said, "I no longer search to be whole. I simply am." His words carried steady peace. Hiroshi's hands folded behind his back, his voice softer now. Hiroshi said, "This is awakening, not an end but a way of being." Daniel exhaled, his voice quiet but firm. Daniel said, "You are free, Ethan." Ethan closed his eyes, listening to the birdsong rising in harmony with the wind. He thought, "The path never ends, but I walk it without fear." The statue's silent gaze seemed to echo his acceptance, the moment whole and unbroken. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks kissed by the fading orange sun. Ethan walked along the temple path, each step unhurried, his robe trailing softly behind. Ethan said, "For the first time I am not searching." Daniel followed, a quiet smile on his face. Daniel said, "You carry peace now." Hiroshi stood at the edge of the path watching with calm eyes. Hiroshi said, "Peace is not carried, Ethan, peace carries you." Ethan stopped, breathing deeply, the cool evening air filling his chest. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I am here." The wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of pine and stone. The moment held no tension, only presence. The courtyard lanterns flickered as night deepened, their glow soft on wet stones. Ethan paused at the temple gate, hands resting on the wooden beam. Ethan said, "The gate I once feared now feels like home." Daniel tilted his head, his voice thoughtful. Daniel said, "Perhaps because you no longer see it as a barrier." Hiroshi walked past them, his steps slow, his words measured. Hiroshi said, "A gate is neither in nor out, it is only what you make of it." Ethan smiled faintly, his heart steady. He thought, "There is no prison, only doors I imagine." The lanterns swayed, casting shadows that danced like quiet spirits. The garden pond shimmered under the moonlight, koi gliding silently below. Ethan knelt at the edge, his reflection whole upon the still water. Ethan said, "Once, I feared the broken image. Now, I see it was never broken." Daniel crouched beside him, eyes fixed on the water. Daniel said, "Your reflection has changed." Hiroshi stood behind them, hands folded. Hiroshi said, "The reflection never changed. Only your eyes did." Ethan touched the water lightly, watching ripples spread outward. His heart no longer clenched at the distortion. Instead, he whispered, "Even in change, I am complete." The night hummed with crickets, each sound like a gentle affirmation. The temple bell rang once, its tone rolling into the still night. Ethan sat beneath the cherry tree, blossoms falling softly onto his shoulders. Ethan said, "Each falling petal once felt like loss. Now it feels like life." Daniel leaned against the trunk, his voice low. Daniel said, "You no longer fight the seasons." Hiroshi stood nearby, the petals settling in his robe folds. Hiroshi said, "To see life in falling is to awaken." Ethan let a blossom rest in his palm, gazing at its fragility. His heart no longer ached, but opened. He whispered, "I am not lost. I am here." The bell's fading echo blended with the rustling leaves. The horizon glowed faintly as dawn approached, casting silver light across the temple grounds. Ethan stood at the edge of the mountain path, gazing outward. Ethan whispered, "I am not lost. I am here." His words dissolved into the breeze. Daniel stood behind, silent but smiling, eyes filled with respect. Hiroshi placed a hand on the railing, his expression still yet radiant with quiet approval. No more words were needed. The silence spoke for them all. The mountains stretched endlessly, yet Ethan no longer felt small. He inhaled deeply, his chest calm, his spirit whole. The world had not changed, but he had, and in that change, everything was new.